The conference call droned on about quarterly projections when I heard the front door slam. I hit mute on my headset and leaned back in my desk chair, listening to familiar voices drift up from the kitchen. Kira's family had arrived for their weekly dinner. Her mother Rena, her brother Jared, and apparently someone else I couldn't identify yet. My name is Cedric Fallon, and I run a small digital security consultancy from our home office. Used to work military intelligence until my clearance got yanked 6 months ago. Funny how these things happen right around the time your wife starts acting strange. Just keep playing victim until you get the insurance settlement, Rena's voice carried clearly through the heating vents. He'll never suspect his own accident. I froze. The Excel spreadsheet on my monitor blurred as those words sank in. His own accident, my accident, the one they were planning. Are you still there, Cedric? My client's voice crackled through the headset. Yeah, sorry. Technical difficulties. Can we reschedule for tomorrow? I ended the call and sat in the growing darkness of my office, listening to the murmur of voices below. 8 years of marriage, and apparently I'd been married to a stranger who was planning something that involved insurance settlements and accidents. The old Cedric might have stormed downstairs demanding explanations. The new Cedric, the one who'd learned patience during 2 tours in Afghanistan and 3 years analyzing enemy communications, stayed put and started recording. My phone captured everything through the vent. Kira's nervous laughter, Jared's deeper voice laying out timelines, and a third voice I now recognized as Drake Torrin, Kira's ex-boyfriend from college. The same Drake who'd been showing up at our house lately under the guise of catching up. The medical records from the car accident are perfect, Drake was saying. Brain trauma, memory issues, emotional instability. Any judge would grant conservatorship. Car accident. Kira's accident from 6 months ago, the one that had left her unconscious for 3 days and changed our entire relationship dynamic. The accident that happened right before my security clearance got suspended, right before old friends started avoiding my calls, right before I became the villain in our marriage story. I opened my laptop and pulled up our shared cloud storage, something Kira had insisted on for transparency in our marriage. Funny how transparent it was about to become. The deleted folder recovery tool I'd written for client cases worked just as well on personal accounts. 14 months of deleted text messages materialized on my screen like ghosts returning from the grave. Group chat after group chat between Kira, Jared, and Rena, with timestamps going back to before Kira's accident. Phase 1 complete. Read a message from January. Cedric's military contacts are questioning his stability. Brent came through with the psychological evaluation reports. Brent Marrow, my mentor, the man who'd recommended me for intelligence work, who'd been asking pointed questions about my mental state during our monthly coffee meetings. The man I'd trusted with my doubts about Kira's behavior changes after her accident. Another message, this one from Kira herself. Drake's ready to publish the leaked documents. Once Cedric's under investigation for the security breach, we can move to Phase 2. My hands trembled as I scrolled through months of planning. They'd been setting me up since before Kira's accident. No, not her accident, her performance. Because according to the medical records I was now pulling from her email account, she'd never been unconscious at all. The hospital records showed conscious patient responses, normal brain scans, and a discharge note recommending she continue current treatment plan as discussed. Not treatment for brain trauma, treatment for whatever game she'd been playing. Cedric? Kira's voice called from the bottom of the stairs. Dinner's ready. I closed the laptop and headed downstairs, my face carefully neutral. The dining room table was set for 5. Kira, myself, Rena, Jared, and Drake, who smiled at me like we were old friends. Drake was just telling us about his latest article, Kira said, her hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture that would have seemed loving to anyone who hadn't just heard her planning my destruction. Something about military intelligence failures. Fascinating subject, I said, cutting into the pot roast Kira had made, my favorite meal, which now felt like a condemned man's last supper. Must take a lot of inside sources to get that kind of classified information. Drake's smile flickered. You'd be surprised how much people are willing to share when they feel betrayed by the system. Betrayed, I repeated, chewing slowly. Interesting word choice. The conversation continued around me, surface-level pleasantries hiding the undercurrent of conspiracy I now understood. Raina asked about my work, feigning concern about my stress levels. Jared mentioned job opportunities in other cities, suggesting maybe a change of scenery would be good for both Kira and me. Drake discussed his upcoming articles about military accountability, all of it orchestrated, all of it designed to push me toward some predetermined breaking point where their plan could unfold. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes while they moved to the living room. In the kitchen, Kira stood close to me at the sink, her voice low and concerned. "You seem distant tonight," she said. "Are you feeling okay? Maybe we should schedule another session with Dr. Morrison." Dr. Morrison, the therapist she'd insisted I see after her accident. The same therapist whose notes I'd just read in her email, describing me as emotionally volatile and potentially dangerous to himself and others. Notes based entirely on Kira's carefully crafted reports of my behavior. "I'm fine," I said, drying a plate with methodical precision. "Just thinking about work stuff." "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Her hand touched my arm, the same gesture of support she'd been using for months while systematically destroying my life. "We're a team." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. The concerned expression, the worried eyes, the loving wife act. All of it perfectly performed, perfectly calculated. "Of course," I said. "We're a team." After they left, I went back to my office and continued reading. The plan was elegantly simple. Isolate me professionally and socially, establish a pattern of mental instability, stage an accident that would leave me incapacitated or worse, then claim insurance benefits and assets through conservatorship. Drake would get his story about military intelligence corruption, Jared would get his cut of the insurance money, and Kira would get her freedom plus a substantial financial settlement. The only problem with their plan was that they'd underestimated their target. I'd spent 3 years analyzing enemy communications, tracking terrorist networks, and identifying security threats. I knew how to build cases, document evidence, and execute operations. They thought they were manipulating some broken veteran who'd lost his edge. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I opened a new document on my laptop and started typing Counterintelligence Operation Family. Then I began planning their destruction with the same methodical precision I'd once used to protect my country. The first step was understanding the full scope of their operation. I spent the next 4 hours recovering every deleted file, every hidden conversation, every piece of their conspiracy. By 3 a.m, I had a complete timeline of their plan and a clear picture of everyone involved. Brent hadn't just been reporting on my mental state, he'd been actively sabotaging my professional relationships, spreading rumors about my reliability, and feeding Kira information from my classified psychological evaluations. The security clearance suspension wasn't due to any investigation into Drake's leaked documents. It was based on Brent's reports, questioning my mental fitness. Drake's articles about military intelligence failures weren't just journalism. They were targeted attacks designed to create the impression that someone with my background and access was leaking classified information. The timing of each article corresponded perfectly with my meetings with Brent, creating a pattern that would implicate me as the source. Kira's accident had been staged with the help of a doctor friend of Raina's, complete with fake medical records and a coordinated story about brain trauma that would explain any future personality changes or memory issues I might develop. The insurance claim from that accident was still pending, waiting for the right moment to cash in. But the most damaging revelation was the extent of my professional isolation. Former colleagues who'd stopped returning my calls, military contacts who'd grown distant, even my security clearance officer, all of them had received carefully crafted reports about my deteriorating mental state and potential security risks. They'd been destroying my life piece by piece for over a year, and I'd been so focused on being a supportive husband that I'd never seen it coming. That was about to change. I started with the digital evidence, creating encrypted backups of everything I'd recovered and storing them in multiple secure locations. Then, I began documenting their current activities, setting up monitoring systems on our shared devices and accounts that would track their communications in real time. The beauty of living with someone who thinks you're mentally unstable is that they don't expect you to be conducting sophisticated surveillance operations from the office upstairs. Over the next week, I watched their plan unfold through intercepted messages and recorded conversations. They were accelerating the timeline, concerned that I was becoming suspicious. The accident was scheduled for the following month, timed to coincide with a major insurance policy renewal that would maximize the payout. Drake had been staying at a downtown apartment, coordinating with Kira through encrypted messaging apps that weren't as secure as they thought. Jared was handling the financial arrangements, setting up accounts and legal structures that would funnel the insurance money through a complex web of transactions designed to hide their conspiracy. Raina was managing the social aspects, spreading rumors about my mental state through her extensive network of community connections, church groups, neighborhood associations, professional organizations. She was systematically destroying my reputation while positioning Kira as the long-suffering wife of an unstable veteran. But they'd made one critical error. They'd underestimated my capabilities and overestimated their own operational security. I began my counterattack on a Tuesday morning while Kira was at work. First, I visited Brent at his office, wearing a wire and carrying a briefcase full of evidence. "We need to talk," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Brent looked nervous, which was unusual for a man who'd once interrogated terrorist suspects without breaking a sweat. "What's on your mind, Cedric?" "My clearance suspension," I said. "I've been thinking about the timing, about the reports that led to the investigation. Funny how they all seem to come from people close to me." "The military takes these things seriously," he said, not meeting my eyes. "When there are concerns about mental stability—" "Whose concerns, Brent?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed messages. Because according to these, the concerns were coming from someone who'd been paid to manufacture them. His face went pale as he recognized Kira's messages discussing their arrangement. Payments for psychological evaluations, schedules for reporting my concerning behavior, even specific phrases to use in his official reports. "This isn't what it looks like," he started. "It looks like you sold out a friend and fellow veteran for money," I said. "It looks like you helped destroy my career to support an insurance fraud scheme. It looks like treason, actually, since you used classified psychological evaluations to do it." The conversation that followed was recorded in its entirety. Brent confessed to everything, explaining how Kira had approached him months before her staged accident, how she'd convinced him that I was genuinely unstable and needed intervention, how the payments had started small but grown larger as his reports became more damaging. By the time I left his office, I had everything I needed to restore my security clearance and implicate him in the conspiracy. Next, I paid a visit to Dr. Morrison, the therapist who'd been documenting my supposed mental health issues based on Kira's fabricated reports. That conversation was more challenging, since doctor-patient confidentiality limited what she could discuss, but I didn't need her to talk. I just needed her to listen. "I have reason to believe that my wife has been providing you with false information about my behavior and mental state," I said, presenting her with printed copies of Kira's messages discussing their therapy strategy. "I also have evidence that these sessions are part of a larger fraud scheme designed to establish grounds for conservatorship." Dr. Morrison's professional composure cracked as she read through the messages. Her notes about my case, which I'd recovered from Kira's email, showed a pattern of escalating concerns that corresponded perfectly with Kira's fabricated reports. "If these allegations are true," she said carefully, "then I've been unknowingly participating in a serious ethical violation." "They are true," I said, "and I'm going to need you to document that in your official records." The rest of the week was spent building cases against each member of their conspiracy. I contacted the insurance company investigating Kira's accident claim, providing them with evidence that her injuries had been fabricated. I reached out to Drake's editor with documentation showing how his articles were based on illegally obtained classified information. I prepared a comprehensive report for the military investigators who'd suspended my clearance, demonstrating how I'd been framed. But the most satisfying preparation was for the confrontation I was planning with Kira herself. Friday evening, she came home from work with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, clearly intending another performance of concerned wife dealing with unstable husband. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner," she said, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "Just the two of us. We haven't talked much this week." "You're right," I said. "We should talk." I helped her unpack the food, making casual conversation about her day at work, her weekend plans, her family, normal married couple talk that felt surreal given what I now knew about her. After dinner, we moved to the living room with our wine. Kira curled up on the couch next to me, her head on my shoulder in a gesture of intimacy that made my skin crawl. "I'm worried about you," she said softly. "You've seemed different lately. Distant. Maybe we should schedule another session with Dr. Morrison." "Actually," I said, reaching for my phone, "I think we should have a different kind of session." I played the recording of my conversation with Brent, watching her face as her mentor's voice filled the room, confessing to his role in destroying my career. Her expression shifted from confusion to recognition to barely controlled panic. "I can explain," she started. "Let me save you the trouble," I said, pulling up the recovered text messages on my laptop. Phase 1. Isolate Cedric professionally and socially. Phase 2. Establish pattern of mental instability. Phase 3. Stage accident and claim insurance benefits. Phase 4. Profit. She stared at the screen, her face cycling through emotions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally resignation. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since last Tuesday when I heard your mother's advice about keeping up the Victim Act." I closed the laptop and looked at her directly. "The question is, how long have you been planning to destroy me?" What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Kira explained how the plan had started as a way to escape what she saw as a suffocating marriage, how it had evolved into a complex financial scheme, how each step had seemed justified by the promise of freedom and money. She talked about feeling trapped in our life together, about wanting excitement and independence, about how Drake had offered her both. She explained how Raina had convinced her that I would never agree to a divorce that left her financially secure, how the insurance fraud had seemed like the only way to guarantee her future. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, which was perhaps the most insulting lie of all. "You wanted me incapacitated or worse," I replied. "You wanted my reputation destroyed, my career ended, my freedom taken away, but you never wanted to hurt me." "It wasn't supposed to be that serious," she said. "Just enough to establish grounds for separation, maybe some medical supervision. The insurance money was supposed to set us both up for new lives." "Both of us?" I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Kira, your plan involved staging an accident that would leave me unable to manage my own affairs. There was no both of us in your future." The conversation ended with her in tears and me feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. The woman I'd loved for 8 years had never existed. She'd been a performance, just like everything else about our marriage. But I wasn't done yet. Saturday morning, I implemented phase 1 of my counterattack while Kira slept late, probably exhausted from the emotional strain of having her conspiracy exposed. I drove to the Lantern, a dive bar on the edge of town where Brent spent his weekend mornings nursing coffee and reading newspapers like he was still gathering intelligence instead of just avoiding his empty apartment. The place smelled like stale beer and broken dreams, which seemed appropriate for confronting a man who'd sold out his principles for money. Brent sat in his usual corner booth, looking older than his 53 years, with the kind of defeat in his shoulders that comes from knowing you've crossed a line you can never uncross. "Cedric," he said as I slid into the seat across from him, "I figured you'd show up here eventually." "Did you?" I signaled the waitress for coffee. "What gave it away? The fact that you've been lying to me for months, or the fact that you helped my wife frame me for treason?" He winced. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. Kira said you were having problems, that you needed help but wouldn't admit it. She made it sound like intervention, not destruction." "Right," I said, "and the money she paid you was just coincidence. The money was for consultation fees, legitimate psychological evaluation services, based on fabricated evidence and designed to destroy my career." I pulled out my phone and set it on the table between us, recording app clearly visible. "Tell me about the reports you filed with the Clearance Review Board." Brent stared at the phone like it was a snake. "I can't discuss classified. The reports are already declassified as part of my appeal process," I lied smoothly. "I'm just giving you a chance to explain your side before the military investigators review your involvement." That got his attention. Military investigators took a dim view of personnel who compromised security clearances for personal gain, and Brent's pension depended on maintaining his own clearance status. "Look," he said, leaning forward. "Kira approached me 6 months before her accident. She was concerned about your mental state, said you were having nightmares, paranoid episodes, talking about people watching you. She asked me to keep an eye on you, maybe provide some professional assessment if needed." "And you believed her?" "I wanted to help. You're like a son to me, Cedric. When she showed me those medical records from her accident, when she talked about how you'd been acting since then, it seemed like you were spiraling." "What medical records?" "Hospital reports, brain scans, doctor's notes about her injuries. She was worried that your guilt over not being there during the accident was making you unstable." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Brent, her accident was staged. Those medical records were fabricated. She was never injured, never unconscious, never in any danger. The whole thing was performance art designed to set up the insurance fraud." His face went through the same progression of emotions I'd seen on Kira's the night before. Confusion, recognition, horror, and finally understanding of how completely he'd been manipulated. "She played you just like she played me," I continued. "Except you were supposed to be a professional. You were supposed to verify information before acting on it. Instead, you took money to file reports that destroyed my career based on nothing but her word." The conversation continued for another hour, with Brent gradually admitting the full extent of his involvement. The psychological evaluations he'd filed weren't based on any direct observation of my behavior. They were based entirely on Kira's reports and his own assumptions about veteran mental health issues. He'd recommended my clearance suspension not because of any evidence of instability, but because Kira had convinced him that I was a security risk who needed intervention before I hurt myself or compromised classified information. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to contact the review board and explain exactly how you were manipulated into filing false reports," I said. "I want you to provide them with documentation of every payment Kira made to you, and I want you to stay away from my family while I clean up the rest of this mess." "And if I don't?" I smiled, and apparently it wasn't a pleasant expression, because he actually leaned back in his seat. "Then I turn over everything I've collected to the military investigators and let them decide whether your actions constitute treason, fraud, or just criminal incompetence. Your choice." He agreed to cooperate, which was Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 required a different approach. I spent Saturday afternoon conducting surveillance on Drake Torin, using skills I'd developed tracking terrorist networks in Afghanistan. Drake lived in a sleek downtown condo that probably cost more than I made in a year, funded by his investigative journalism career and whatever side payments he received for publishing leaked classified information. Following him was almost insultingly easy. He had no operational awareness, no understanding of surveillance techniques, no sense that anyone might be watching him. For a man who claimed to investigate government conspiracies, he was remarkably naive about his own security. He spent the afternoon at a coffee shop, working on his laptop and making phone calls that I recorded using a directional microphone from my car. Most of the calls were routine business, editors, sources, interview subjects. But one call was to Jared, Kira's brother, and that conversation was worth the entire day of surveillance. "The timeline's moved up," Drake said. "Cedric's getting suspicious. Kira thinks he might know something." "How much does he know?" Jared's voice came through clearly on my recording equipment. "We're not sure, but we can't wait until next month. The accident needs to happen this week, or we risk him figuring out the whole operation." "This week?" Jared sounded nervous. "Everything's not in place yet. The insurance paperwork, the medical arrangements, the legal documentation." "Then get it in place," Drake snapped. "Because if Cedric exposes this before we can execute, we're all going to prison." They discussed logistics for another 10 minutes, locations, timing, methods. The accident they were planning wasn't just designed to incapacitate me. It was designed to eliminate me entirely. Insurance fraud had evolved into conspiracy to commit homicide, which changed the stakes considerably. After the call, Drake drove to a storage unit facility on the outskirts of town. I followed at a distance, watching as he retrieved a large duffel bag from Unit 247. Whatever was in that bag, it was heavy enough that he struggled to lift it into his car. I made note of the storage facility location and unit number. Breaking into storage units wasn't particularly difficult if you had the right tools and knowledge, but I decided to wait and see what Drake did with whatever he'd retrieved. He drove to a construction site about 20 minutes outside town, where a new shopping center was being built. The site was deserted on Saturday afternoon, just empty foundations and heavy machinery sitting idle until Monday morning. Drake parked near a section of the construction where the foundation work was still in progress. Deep excavations, unstable ground, the kind of place where an accident could easily happen to someone who wasn't careful. He walked around the site for about 30 minutes, taking photos and making notes, clearly planning something. I documented everything from a concealed position about 200 yards away, using telephoto lenses to capture clear images of Drake's activities. Whatever they were planning, this construction site was going to be the location. Sunday morning brought Phase 3. Confronting Jared directly. Kira's brother worked as a financial consultant, which was a polite way of saying he helped wealthy people hide money from taxes and ex-spouses. His office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, all dark wood and expensive furniture designed to project trustworthiness and discretion. I arrived early before his secretary and waited in the parking lot until he showed up for what appeared to be weekend work. Jared was younger than Kira, maybe 28, with the kind of soft features that suggested he'd never been in a real fight in his life. "Cedric," he said as I approached his car, "what are you doing here?" "We need to discuss your sister's insurance fraud scheme," I said, "and your role in planning my accident." His face went pale, but he tried to maintain composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." I pulled out my phone and played a snippet of his conversation with Drake. "The timeline's moved up. The accident needs to happen this week." Jared looked around the empty parking lot like he was considering running, which would have been amusing since I was in considerably better physical condition than his soft consultant lifestyle had left him. "Let's go inside and talk," he said finally. His office was exactly what I'd expected. Leather chairs, mahogany desk, walls covered with certificates and awards that were probably more impressive to clients than they were meaningful in reality. Jared poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, his hands shaking slightly. "How much do you know?" he asked. Everything, I said. The staged accident, the insurance fraud, the plan to eliminate me, your role in laundering the money through offshore accounts. The only thing I don't know is why you thought you could get away with it. He sat down heavily in his chair, looking older than his years. It started small. Kira wanted out of her marriage, but she was worried about the financial implications of divorce. She asked me to help her understand the asset distribution, what she could expect in a settlement. And you suggested insurance fraud instead? Not initially. He took a sip of his drink. But when she told me about the life insurance policies, about how much money was involved, it seemed like there might be other options. Other options, I repeated, like making me disappear. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, he said quickly. The original plan was just incapacitation, maybe some memory issues, enough to establish conservatorship and access the insurance benefits. But then Drake got involved, and everything became more complicated. Complicated how? Jared explained how Drake's involvement had changed the scope of the operation. What started as a simple insurance fraud scheme had evolved into something much more elaborate, involving leaked classified information, manufactured evidence of mental instability, and ultimately the decision that I needed to be eliminated entirely rather than just incapacitated. Drake convinced Kira that you were too smart, too well-trained to fool for long, Jared said. He said that unless you were completely out of the picture, you'd eventually figure out what was happening and expose everyone involved. Smart man, I said, except he underestimated how much I'd already figured out. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jared providing details about the financial structure they'd created to hide the insurance money, the timeline for executing their plan, and the specific roles each person was supposed to play. By the time I left his office, I had enough evidence to destroy all of them. But I wasn't ready to turn everything over to the authorities yet. I wanted them to understand exactly how completely they'd been outmaneuvered before their world collapsed. Sunday evening, I returned home to find Kira cooking dinner, acting as if our confrontation Friday night had never happened. She greeted me with a smile and a kiss, playing the role of loving wife with the same skill she'd demonstrated for months. "How was your weekend?" she asked, stirring something that smelled delicious on the stove. "Educational," I said. "I learned a lot about construction sites, storage units, and financial consulting." Her stirring faltered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Sounds interesting. Work-related?" "You could say that." I sat at the kitchen table and watched her cook, marveling at her ability to maintain the performance even now. "I also had some interesting conversations with Brent and your brother." This time she couldn't hide her reaction. The wooden spoon clattered against the pot, and her shoulders tensed visibly. "What kind of conversations?" she asked, not turning around. "The kind where people tell the truth about conspiracy and attempted homicide," I said. "The kind where they realize they've been manipulated by someone much smarter than they gave her credit for." She turned to face me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not the performed vulnerability she'd been showing me for months, but real terror at being caught in something she couldn't talk her way out of. "Cedric," she started. "Save it," I said. "I know about the construction site. I know about the storage unit. I know about the accelerated timeline. I know everything, Kira. The only question now is what I'm going to do about it." We stared at each other across the kitchen, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage her plan or if she needed to cut her losses and run. "What do you want?" she asked finally. I smiled, and this time I didn't try to make it pleasant. "I want you to understand what it feels like to have your life destroyed by someone you trusted. I want you to experience the same fear and helplessness you were planning to inflict on me. And I want you to know that everything you've worked for, everything you've planned, is about to disappear. And then what? Then we see how well you handle being the victim instead of the predator." That night, I finalized my preparations for the counterattack. Phase 4 was going to be the most satisfying part of the entire operation because it was going to be public, humiliating, and absolutely devastating to everyone involved. But first, I had one more conversation to have with the person who'd started this entire conspiracy, Raina Favren, Kira's mother, and the mastermind behind the plan to destroy my life. Monday morning, I drove to Raina's house in the affluent Maple Heights neighborhood, where she held court among the other wealthy widows who ran the town's social hierarchy. Her home was a monument to appearances: perfectly manicured lawn, expensive cars in the driveway, and the kind of architectural details that screamed money and status. I rang the doorbell at precisely 9 o'clock, knowing she'd be finishing her morning routine of coffee, newspaper, and phone calls to coordinate whatever social manipulation she had planned for the day. "Cedric," she said, opening the door with the same cold smile she'd been giving me for 8 years. "This is unexpected. Kira didn't mention you were coming by." "Kira doesn't know I'm here," I said. "We need to discuss your insurance fraud scheme and your plan to have me eliminated." Her composure didn't crack, which I had to admire. Raina had spent decades perfecting the art of social manipulation, and it would take more than a direct accusation to rattle her. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she said, "but please come in. We should talk." Her living room was a showcase of expensive taste and subtle intimidation. Antique furniture, family portraits going back generations, and the kind of carefully curated atmosphere designed to make visitors feel inferior. I'd always felt uncomfortable in this room, which had probably been the point. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, settling into her chair with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "I'd like you to explain why you decided I needed to have an accident," I said, pulling out my phone and setting it on the coffee table between us. "And I'd like you to do it honestly, because I already have recordings of everyone else involved." Raina glanced at the phone, then back at my face, evaluating the situation with the calculating intelligence that had made her such an effective manipulator. "You're recording this conversation without my consent," she said. "Massachusetts is a one-party consent state," I replied. "I can record any conversation I'm part of, and I can use those recordings as evidence in criminal proceedings, which there will be, unless you convince me otherwise in the next few minutes." She was quiet for a long moment, studying me with new respect. The broken veteran she'd been manipulating for months had been replaced by someone much more dangerous, and she was smart enough to recognize the change. "Kira was unhappy," she said finally. "She felt trapped in a marriage that wasn't fulfilling her potential. As her mother, I wanted to help her find a way to build a better life. By committing insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit homicide. By helping her access resources that would allow her to start over." Raina's voice remained calm, matter-of-fact, as if we were discussing investment strategies rather than attempted homicide. The insurance policies were legitimate. The benefits would have provided financial security for both of you. "Both of us," I repeated. "Except your plan involved making sure I wasn't around to enjoy that financial security." "The plan evolved as circumstances changed," she admitted. "Initially, we hoped that establishing conservatorship would be sufficient. You would have been cared for, your needs met, while Kira managed the financial arrangements. Under your guidance. I have more experience with complex financial matters than Kira does. It would have been natural for me to provide advice and oversight." I had to admire her ability to make conspiracy and fraud sound like reasonable family financial planning. Raina had probably been manipulating people for so long that she genuinely believed her own justifications. "Tell me about Drake's role," I said. Drake provided expertise we lacked. His background in investigative journalism gave him access to information and resources that were useful for the operation. Information like my classified psychological evaluations. Information that helped us understand your mental state and potential reactions to various scenarios. She paused, choosing her words carefully. We needed to ensure that our approach would be effective, and that you wouldn't become suspicious, before we could implement the plan. And when you realized I was too smart to fool indefinitely, you decided I needed to be eliminated entirely. Raina's mask finally slipped, just for a moment, and I saw the cold calculation underneath her grandmother facade. Drake felt that your military background made you too dangerous to leave partially incapacitated. He was concerned that you would eventually piece together what had happened and take revenge. Smart man, I said. He was absolutely right about that. We talked for another 30 minutes, with Raina gradually revealing the full scope of their operation. She'd been the strategic planner, coordinating between Drake's intelligence gathering, Jared's financial arrangements, and Kira's performance as the concerned wife. She'd also been managing the social aspects, using her network of community connections to spread rumors about my mental state and establish the narrative that would support their insurance claims. "You've been very thorough," she said as our conversation wound down. "What do you plan to do with this information?" "That depends on what you do next," I said. "I'm going to give you and your co-conspirators exactly 24 hours to confess your crimes to the appropriate authorities and make arrangements to compensate me for the damage you've caused to my career and reputation. And if we don't?" I smiled, and for the first time in our conversation, Raina looked genuinely nervous. "Then I implement my own plan, which will be considerably more unpleasant for all of you than voluntary confession." "What kind of plan?" "The kind that turns you from predators into prey," I said, standing to leave. "The kind that makes you understand exactly what it feels like to have your life destroyed by someone you underestimated." I left her sitting in her perfect living room, probably for the first time in decades, unsure of her ability to control the situation around her. The rest of Monday was spent implementing Phase 5 of my counterattack, systematic destruction of their support network. I started with Drake's professional reputation, sending carefully documented evidence of his use of illegally obtained classified information to his editor, his professional journalism association, and the federal investigators who handle security breaches. The evidence was overwhelming, not just the classified documents he'd published, but proof of how he'd obtained them, his coordination with Kira to access my home office files, and his use of that information to frame me as the source of the leaks. By Tuesday morning, Drake would be facing federal charges and the end of his journalism career. Next, I contacted the insurance company handling Kira's accident claim, providing them with the medical evidence proving her injuries had been fabricated, recordings of family conversations discussing the fraud, and documentation of the financial structure Jared had created to hide the proceeds. Insurance companies take fraud very seriously, especially when it involves potentially millions of dollars in false claims. Then I reached out to the state licensing board that oversaw Jared's financial consulting practice, presenting them with evidence of his involvement in money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and his use of his professional position to facilitate criminal activity. Financial consultants who lose their licenses tend to have difficulty finding other employment, especially when their misconduct involves federal crimes. But the most satisfying part of Monday's work was destroying Raina's social network. I spent the afternoon making phone calls to her church, her charity organizations, her social clubs, and her neighborhood association, providing each group with carefully selected evidence of her role in the conspiracy. I didn't present everything. That would have seemed overwhelming and potentially unbelievable. Instead, I gave each organization just enough information to raise serious questions about Raina's character and judgment, along with suggestions that they might want to reconsider her involvement in their activities. By Monday evening, Raina's phone was ringing constantly as friends and associates called to ask uncomfortable questions about her family's activities. Her carefully maintained reputation was beginning to crumble, and she was discovering how quickly social status could disappear when people started questioning your integrity. Tuesday morning brought the first visible results of my counterattack. Drake called Kira in a panic, a call I intercepted and recorded using the monitoring systems I'd installed on our home phone and her cell phone. They suspended my press credentials, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. The FBI wants to interview me about the classified documents. They know everything, Kira. They know how I got the information. They know about our relationship. They know about the plan. Calm down, Kira said, but I could hear the strain in her voice. We can handle this. We just need to stick to the story and— What story? Drake interrupted. Cedric has recordings of all of us discussing the conspiracy. He has documentation of the insurance fraud. He has proof that your accident was staged. There is no story that explains this away. Then what do you want to do? I want to run, Drake said. I want to disappear before the FBI decides to arrest me for espionage and conspiracy to commit homicide. You can't run. That will just make you look guilty. I am guilty, Drake snapped. We're all guilty. And Cedric has enough evidence to put us all in federal prison for the next 20 years. The call ended with Drake hanging up on Kira, apparently having decided that loyalty to co-conspirators was less important than self-preservation. I made a note to monitor his activities more closely, since desperate people often made unpredictable decisions. Tuesday afternoon, Jared called an emergency family meeting at Raina's house. I knew about the meeting because I'd been monitoring all their communications, and I decided it was time to make my presence known in a more direct way. I arrived at Raina's house 30 minutes after the meeting started, letting myself in through the back door using skills I'd learned during my military service. The security system was expensive, but not particularly sophisticated, and it was designed to keep out burglars, not intelligence professionals. I made my way to the living room, where Kira, Jared, and Raina were having what sounded like a heated argument about damage control and exit strategies. They were so focused on their crisis that they didn't notice me until I cleared my throat from the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, I said, settling into the chair I'd occupied during my conversation with Raina the day before. But I thought you might want to know how your 24 hours are going. The silence that followed was profound. Kira looked terrified, Jared looked like he might vomit, and Raina looked older than I'd ever seen her. Cedric, Kira started. Let me save you some time, I said, pulling out my laptop and opening it on the coffee table. Drake's press credentials have been suspended pending a federal investigation into his use of classified information. The insurance company has frozen your accident claim and opened a fraud investigation. Jared's licensing board has received a complaint about his professional conduct that will probably result in suspension of his consulting license. And Raina's social calendar has become remarkably empty as her friends and associates distance themselves from the family scandal. I turned the laptop screen toward them, showing a spreadsheet that detailed every action I'd taken against their conspiracy, every piece of evidence I'd provided to various authorities, and every consequence they were facing as a result of their crimes. This is just the beginning, I continued. Phase 1 was documenting your conspiracy. Phase 2 was gathering evidence of your crimes. Phase 3 was destroying your support networks. Phase 4 starts tomorrow, and it involves public exposure of everything you've done. What do you want? Raina asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I want you to understand what it feels like to be the victim instead of the predator, I said. I want you to experience the fear, helplessness, and social isolation you were planning to inflict on me. I want you to know that your lives, your reputations, and your freedom are in the hands of someone you tried to destroy. And then what? Kira asked. Then we see how well you handle being hunted instead of being the hunters. I closed the laptop and stood to leave, but paused at the doorway to deliver one final message. Oh, and Kira, I've filed for divorce. You'll be served with papers tomorrow morning. I'm sure your lawyer will explain how Massachusetts handles asset distribution when one spouse has committed fraud against the other. I left them sitting in stunned silence, probably for the first time in their lives, completely out of options and entirely at someone else's mercy. Wednesday morning brought Phase 4, public exposure. I'd spent months being isolated and humiliated by their systematic campaign to destroy my reputation. Now it was their turn to experience social exile and public shame. I started with a carefully crafted email to everyone in our shared social network: friends, neighbors, professional contacts, community organizations. The email included a detailed but factual account of the conspiracy against me, supported by selected evidence that proved my claims without revealing information that might compromise ongoing investigations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who'd been avoiding me for months suddenly wanted to meet for coffee and hear the whole story. Neighbors who'd been giving me suspicious looks started stopping by to offer support and ask how they could help. Professional contacts who'd been questioning my reliability began calling to apologize and discuss future opportunities. But the most satisfying response came from the community organizations that Reina had been using to spread rumors about my mental state. Church groups, charity boards, and social clubs that had been distancing themselves from me based on her whisper campaign suddenly understood how they'd been manipulated, and they were not pleased about it. By Wednesday afternoon, Reina's phone had stopped ringing entirely. Not because people had stopped talking about the scandal, but because no one wanted to talk to her anymore. Thursday brought news that Drake had indeed decided to run, abandoning his apartment and disappearing without telling anyone where he was going. His decision to flee probably saved me the trouble of destroying him more systematically, since running from a federal investigation was essentially a confession of guilt that would follow him for the rest of his life. Friday morning, Kira moved out of our house, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind everything we'd accumulated during 8 years of marriage. She didn't say goodbye, didn't try to apologize, didn't attempt any final manipulation. She just packed her things and left, probably understanding that nothing she could say would change what was about to happen to her. But I wasn't done yet. The most important phase of my counterattack was still to come, and it was going to be public, humiliating, and absolutely final. The annual Founders' Day Charity Gala was Maple Heights' most important social event, where the town's elite gathered to celebrate their community spirit while displaying their wealth and status. Reina had been on the organizing committee for 15 years, and Kira had been actively involved for the past 5. It was the perfect venue for the final phase of my counterattack. I arrived at the Riverside Country Club on Saturday evening wearing my dress uniform, which I hadn't worn since my military service ended. The ribbons and decorations told a story of service and sacrifice that most people in attendance could never understand, but they would recognize the authority and competence they represented. The ballroom was full of familiar faces: neighbors, business associates, community leaders, and social climbers who formed the backbone of our town's power structure. Many of them had been influenced by Reina's whisper campaign against me over the past months, accepting her carefully crafted narrative about my mental instability and potential danger to the community. Tonight, they were going to learn the truth. I made my way through the crowd, greeting people with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. The conversations were polite but cautious. Many attendees weren't sure what to believe about the rumors that had been circulating since my email earlier in the week. "Cedric," said Margaret Chen, who ran the local historical society, "I have to say, your message this week was quite shocking. Are you certain about these allegations against the Favren family?" "Completely certain," I replied. "I have documentation, recordings, and witness statements that prove everything I described. The FBI is currently investigating the national security implications, and the insurance companies are pursuing fraud charges." Word of my presence spread quickly through the ballroom. I could see people pointing and whispering, trying to reconcile the composed, articulate man in front of them with the unstable veteran they'd been told to fear. Reina arrived fashionably late, as was her custom, wearing an elegant black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She moved through the crowd with her usual regal bearing, but I could see the strain in her smile and the tension in her shoulders. She knew I was there, and she knew what was coming. Kira accompanied her mother, looking beautiful and vulnerable in a way that had once made my heart race, but now left me completely cold. She'd always been skilled at playing the role of innocent victim, and tonight she was giving an Oscar-worthy performance of a woman bravely facing false accusations. The evening proceeded normally for the first hour: cocktails, small talk, and the kind of social posturing that defined these events. I circulated through the crowd, making sure to speak with as many people as possible, presenting myself as rational, articulate, and completely in control. At 8 o'clock, the formal program began with speeches from various community leaders about the importance of civic engagement and social responsibility. The irony was not lost on me, given that some of the evening's honored guests had spent months conspiring to commit insurance fraud and attempted homicide. When Raina took the stage to deliver her traditional remarks as a founding committee member, I made my move. I'd spent the previous day working with a contact from my military service who specialized in audiovisual systems. The country club's sound system was sophisticated but not particularly secure, and it was surprisingly easy to gain access to the control booth during the cocktail hour. As Raina began her speech about community values and supporting our neighbors, I activated the system I'd installed. Her voice was replaced by a recording of her own words from our conversation earlier in the week. The plan evolved as circumstances changed. Initially, we hoped that establishing conservatorship would be sufficient. You would have been cared for, your needs met, while Kira managed the financial arrangements. The ballroom fell silent as Raina's recorded voice filled the space, describing the conspiracy to defraud insurance companies and establish illegal conservatorship over my assets. Her face went pale as she realized what was happening, but she was trapped on stage with nowhere to hide. The recording continued with more damaging excerpts: discussions of the staged accident, plans to eliminate me entirely, and casual references to destroying my career and reputation. Each revelation hit the audience like a physical blow, and I could see the shock and disgust spreading through the crowd. Drake felt that your military background made you too dangerous to leave partially incapacitated. He was concerned that you would eventually piece together what had happened and take revenge. When that particular excerpt played, several people in the audience turned to look at me with new understanding. The dangerous, unstable veteran they'd been warned about was actually the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, and the people they'd trusted were the real threats to community safety. I let the recordings play for about 5 minutes, providing enough evidence to prove my claims without overwhelming the audience with details. Then I restored normal sound system operation and took the stage myself. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I apologize for the interruption, but I felt you deserved to hear the truth about the Favren family's activities over the past year." I spent the next 10 minutes providing a concise but comprehensive account of the conspiracy against me, supported by the recordings they'd just heard and documentation I projected onto the screens around the ballroom. I explained how Raina had used her social connections to spread false rumors about my mental state, how Kira had fabricated evidence of abuse and instability, and how they'd planned to eliminate me entirely once they realized I was too intelligent to fool indefinitely. The audience's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Shock gave way to anger as they realized how completely they'd been manipulated. People who'd been avoiding me for months looked embarrassed and ashamed. Community leaders who'd been questioning my fitness for various roles began apologizing publicly. But the most satisfying reaction came from Raina's social circle, the wealthy widows and society matrons who formed the core of Maple Heights' power structure. These women had built their reputations on moral superiority and social responsibility, and they were not pleased to discover that one of their own had been using them to facilitate conspiracy and fraud. "This is outrageous," shouted Eleanor Whitman, who chaired the hospital foundation board. "Raina, how could you involve all of us in your criminal activities?" "We trusted you," added Patricia Morrison, whose husband ran the largest law firm in town. We repeated your stories. We excluded Cedric from events. We questioned his character, all based on lies you told us to cover up your own crimes. The confrontation that followed was brutal and public. Raina tried to maintain her composure, but she was facing a room full of people who now understood how they'd been manipulated, and their anger was focused entirely on her. Kira attempted to support her mother, playing the role of confused daughter who'd been misled by others. But the audience had heard enough recordings to know that she'd been a willing participant in every aspect of the conspiracy. "You staged your own accident," said Dr. Harrison, who'd treated Kira after her supposed car crash. "You came to my emergency room. You let me run tests. You accepted treatment for injuries you never sustained. You made me complicit in insurance fraud." The evening continued to deteriorate for the Fallon family as more people stepped forward to describe how they'd been manipulated or deceived. Business associates talked about suspicious financial advice from Jared. Church members discussed Raina's efforts to have me excluded from various activities. Neighbors described being asked to report on my behavior and mental state. By the end of the evening, the Fallon family was completely isolated. Friends had become accusers, allies had become enemies, and their carefully constructed social network had collapsed entirely. But I wasn't finished yet. Sunday morning, I implemented the final phase of my counterattack: complete social and economic exile. I spent the day making phone calls to every organization, business, and social group that had any connection to the Fallon family, providing them with documentation of the conspiracy and suggesting they might want to reconsider those relationships. The response was swift and decisive. Raina was removed from every board and committee she'd served on. Her church asked her to find another congregation. Her country club revoked her membership. Even her hair salon and favorite restaurants made it clear that she was no longer welcome. Jared's business collapsed as clients canceled contracts and professional associations distanced themselves from the scandal. His licensing board accelerated their investigation, and it became clear that his career in financial consulting was over. Kira found herself unemployed when her law firm decided that having an employee under investigation for insurance fraud and conspiracy was bad for their reputation. Her apartment application was rejected when the landlord discovered her legal troubles. Even her gym canceled her membership. By Monday morning, the Fallon family had been completely ostracized from the community they'd once dominated. They were facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, professional ruin, and social exile, everything they'd planned to inflict on me, but amplified by the public nature of their exposure. But the most satisfying development came Tuesday morning, when I received a call from the Military Clearance Review Board. "Mr. Fallon," said Colonel Martinez, who'd been handling my case, "we've completed our investigation into the circumstances surrounding your clearance suspension. Based on the evidence you provided and our own findings, we're reinstating your security clearance immediately and expunging all references to mental health concerns from your record." "Thank you, Colonel. We also want to apologize for the way this case was handled. The false reports filed by Mr. Marrow and the fabricated evidence provided by your wife created a situation where our normal review processes were compromised. We're implementing new procedures to prevent similar manipulation in the future." "I appreciate that. There's one more thing," the colonel continued. "The Department of Defense is considering offering you a position with our counterintelligence division, based on your handling of this situation. Your ability to identify, document, and neutralize a complex conspiracy operation demonstrates exactly the kind of skills we need." I accepted the position, which came with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to use my skills protecting national security instead of just analyzing it. The job also came with a relocation package, which meant I could leave Maple Heights and start fresh somewhere new. Wednesday morning, I put our house on the market and began making arrangements to move to Washington, D.C., where my new position would be based. The house sold within a week to a young couple who were excited about the neighborhood and completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded there. As I packed my belongings, I found myself thinking about the past year and how completely my life had changed. 12 months ago, I'd been a struggling security consultant, married to a woman I thought I loved, isolated from friends and colleagues, facing the loss of my career and reputation. Now, I was a federal counterintelligence officer with restored credibility, a new career, and complete freedom from the people who'd tried to destroy me. More importantly, I'd learned that I was far more capable than I'd ever imagined when it came to protecting myself and fighting back against people who underestimated me. The Favren family had taught me valuable lessons about trust, vigilance, and the importance of never underestimating your enemies. They'd also taught me that sometimes the best defense is an overwhelming offense, and that people who live by manipulation and deception are particularly vulnerable when their own tactics are turned against them. But the most important lesson I'd learned was that secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when someone with the right skills and motivation decides to dig them up. 3 weeks after the charity gala, I was finishing the last of my packing when I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed Jared's number, which surprised me since he'd been avoiding all contact since his business collapsed and his license was suspended. "Cedric," he said, his voice strained and desperate. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I replied, continuing to pack books into a moving box. "I thought we'd covered everything pretty thoroughly." "There are things you don't know," he said. "Things about the plan, about why it really started. Kira wasn't the mastermind. She was being manipulated just like you were." That got my attention. I'd assumed that Kira was a willing participant in the conspiracy from the beginning, but Jared's tone suggested there might be more to the story. "I'm listening," I said. "Not over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere? Somewhere private where we can talk without being overheard?" I considered the request. Jared was facing criminal charges and professional ruin, which made him potentially dangerous in the way that desperate people often became. But he was also the weakest link in the conspiracy, and if there were additional secrets to uncover, he was the most likely person to reveal them. "There's a cabin about 20 miles north of town," I said, giving him directions to a property I'd rented for the weekend as a final retreat before leaving Massachusetts. "Meet me there at 7 tonight. Come alone." "I will," he said. "And Cedric, thank you for giving me this chance." I spent the afternoon preparing for what might be another confrontation or might be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. Either way, I wanted to be ready for any possibility. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles in any direction. It was the kind of place where people could have honest conversations without worrying about being overheard or interrupted. It was also the kind of place where people could disappear if conversations went badly, which was why I'd chosen it. I arrived early and spent some time checking the perimeter, making sure Jared hadn't brought backup or set up any kind of ambush. The military had taught me to be paranoid about meetings in isolated locations, and recent events had reinforced the wisdom of that paranoia. Jared arrived precisely at 7, driving a rental car that suggested his own vehicle had been repossessed along with everything else he'd lost. He looked older than his 28 years, with the kind of stress-induced aging that comes from facing criminal prosecution and financial ruin. "Thank you for coming," he said, as we met on the cabin's front porch. "Thank you for making it interesting," I replied, gesturing for him to go inside. The cabin was simply furnished with a kitchen, living room, and 2 bedrooms. I'd stocked it with coffee, food, and recording equipment that would capture whatever conversation we were about to have. "You said Kira was being manipulated," I began once we were settled in the living room. "Explain that." Jared took a deep breath, like a man preparing to confess sins he'd been carrying for months. "The insurance fraud was never Kira's idea. It was never even primarily about the money, though that was part of it. The real goal was something else entirely." "Which was?" Destroying you specifically, not just getting rid of an inconvenient husband. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Someone wanted you discredited, isolated, and eliminated because of your work in military intelligence. That was not what I'd expected to hear. Someone wanted me eliminated for professional reasons. Someone wanted the classified information you had access to, and they wanted you neutralized as a potential threat to operations you might have uncovered during your intelligence work. I leaned back in my chair, processing this new information. If Jared was telling the truth, then the conspiracy against me wasn't just domestic, it had national security implications. Who? I asked. I don't know their real names, Jared said. But Drake wasn't just Kira's ex-boyfriend who happened to be a journalist. He was working for people who wanted access to your classified files and your knowledge of military intelligence operations. And Kira? Kira thought she was planning an escape from an unhappy marriage. She didn't know about the larger operation until it was too late to back out. Jared's voice was bitter with regret. By the time she understood what she'd gotten involved in, they had enough evidence of her participation in the insurance fraud to ensure her cooperation. What about you and your mother? Same thing. We thought we were helping Kira get out of a bad situation and maybe making some money in the process. We didn't realize we were part of a foreign intelligence operation until Drake started making demands that had nothing to do with insurance money. I studied Jared's face, looking for signs of deception. He seemed genuinely distressed, genuinely regretful, and genuinely afraid of something beyond just criminal prosecution. What kind of demands? Access to your home office, copies of any files you brought home, information about your work schedule and travel plans. Drake said it was all part of building the case against your mental stability, but some of the requests didn't make sense for that purpose. Such as? He wanted detailed floor plans of your office building, information about security procedures, schedules for other personnel who worked in your division. That's not the kind of information you need for a domestic conspiracy. That's the kind of information you need for a penetration operation. The implications were staggering. If Jared was telling the truth, then my wife hadn't just been planning insurance fraud. She'd been unknowingly facilitating espionage operations against U.S. military intelligence. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because Drake disappeared, but the people he was working for didn't. They've been contacting Kira, demanding that she continue providing information about you, threatening to expose her role in the conspiracy if she doesn't cooperate. What kind of information? Your new job, your new location, your security clearance status, your current projects. They want to know everything about your work with the counterintelligence division. That changed everything. If foreign agents were actively targeting me through my ex-wife, then this wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was a national security issue that needed to be reported to the appropriate authorities. Where is Kira now? I asked. That's why I called you, Jared said. She's missing. She was supposed to meet with Drake's contacts yesterday to provide them with information about your new position, but she never showed up. Her apartment is empty, her phone is disconnected, and no one has seen her since Tuesday. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. If Kira had been taken by foreign agents, then she was either being held as leverage against me or she was already gone because she'd outlived her usefulness. Have you contacted the police? With what story? That my sister, who's under investigation for insurance fraud and conspiracy, has disappeared while being pressured by foreign agents to commit espionage? They'd think I was trying to create a distraction from our criminal charges. He had a point. The local police weren't equipped to handle international espionage cases, and the FBI would need substantial evidence before they'd take the threat seriously. What do you want from me? I asked. Help, Jared said simply. Help finding Kira. Help dealing with these people. Help figuring out how to get out of this mess without ending up in federal prison or worse. I considered his request. Jared and his family had spent months trying to destroy my life, and I had no particular reason to trust him now. But if there were foreign agents involved, then the situation had implications beyond personal revenge. "I'll need proof," I said. "Documentation, recordings, evidence that supports what you're telling me." "I have some of Drake's communications," Jared said, pulling out a tablet. "Messages about the intelligence requirements, discussions of payment schedules, references to handlers and operational security." I spent the next hour reviewing the materials Jared had brought. The communications were damaging and clearly showed that Drake had been working for someone with sophisticated intelligence capabilities and significant financial resources. More importantly, the messages revealed that the operation against me was ongoing. Even though Drake had disappeared and the domestic conspiracy had been exposed, his handlers were still actively seeking information about my current activities and future plans. "This is bigger than I thought," I said finally. "What do we do?" "We contact the FBI and turn this over to people who are trained to handle international espionage cases," I said. "And then we hope that Kira is still alive and that we can find her before it's too late." But even as I said it, I knew that official channels might not move fast enough if Kira was in immediate danger. The FBI would need time to verify the intelligence, coordinate with other agencies, and develop a response plan. If foreign agents had taken Kira, she might not have that much time. "There's something else," Jared said. "One of Drake's messages mentioned a deadline. They need the information about your new position by this weekend, or they're moving to what they called alternative methods." "Alternative methods?" "I think that means they're planning to come after you directly instead of trying to get information through Kira." That settled it. This was no longer a matter for local law enforcement or even normal FBI procedures. This was an active threat against a federal counterintelligence officer, which meant it fell under the jurisdiction of the agencies I now worked for. I pulled out my secure phone and called my new supervisor at the Department of Defense. "Colonel Martinez," I said when he answered. "This is Cedric Fallon. I need to report a potential national security threat involving foreign agents targeting me through my ex-wife." The conversation that followed was brief and professional. Colonel Martinez took the threat seriously and immediately activated protocols for protecting targeted personnel and investigating foreign intelligence operations. "We're sending a team to your location," he said. "Don't leave the cabin, don't contact anyone else, and don't take any actions that might compromise the investigation. We'll handle this from here." I hung up and turned to Jared, who'd been listening to my side of the conversation with growing alarm. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we wait for the professionals to arrive and hope that we're not too late to help Kira." But I had no intention of just waiting. If foreign agents had taken my ex-wife, if they were planning to come after me directly, then this had become personal again, and I'd already demonstrated what happened to people who made the mistake of targeting me. The difference was that this time, I wouldn't be working alone. I'd have the full resources of the U.S. counterintelligence community backing me up, which meant the people who'd been hunting me were about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by professionals. 2 hours later, the cabin was surrounded by federal agents representing multiple agencies. The FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency had all sent personnel to investigate what was turning out to be a significant foreign intelligence operation. Agent Sarah Coleman from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division took the lead on the investigation, interviewing both Jared and me extensively about the conspiracy, Drake's activities, and the evidence we'd collected. "This is more sophisticated than most domestic espionage cases," she said, after reviewing the materials. "The use of personal relationships, the long-term planning, the integration of criminal activity with intelligence gathering, this has the hallmarks of a state-sponsored operation." "Which state?" I asked. "We're still analyzing the communications and financial records, but the operational patterns suggest either Russian or Chinese intelligence services. Both countries have been increasingly aggressive about targeting U.S. military personnel with access to sensitive information." "What about Kira?" Agent Coleman's expression was grim. We're treating her disappearance as a kidnapping with national security implications. Every available resource is being devoted to finding her. But I have to be honest. The longer she's missing, the less likely we are to find her alive. The investigation continued through the night, with teams of analysts working to trace Drake's communications, identify his handlers, and locate any safe houses or operational facilities in the area. By morning, they'd made significant progress. Drake's financial records showed payments from shell companies linked to Russian intelligence services. His communications revealed a network of agents operating throughout New England, targeting military personnel and defense contractors. Most importantly, they'd identified 3 locations where Kira might be held: abandoned warehouses, remote properties, and safe houses that had been used for previous operations. "We're preparing to move on all 3 locations simultaneously," Agent Coleman told me. "But we want you there as an observer, in case Kira needs to see a familiar face when we find her." I agreed, though I suspected my role would be more than just observational. If this rescue operation went wrong, if Kira was hurt, or if the agents got away, I would still be a target. The only way to secure my long-term safety was to make sure that everyone involved in the operation against me was either captured or neutralized. The first location was a warehouse complex about 30 miles from town, where thermal imaging had detected multiple heat signatures that might indicate human presence. The assault team moved in at dawn, using overwhelming force to neutralize any resistance. They found the warehouse empty, except for surveillance equipment and communications gear that suggested it had been used as an operational base. But there were signs of recent activity, including evidence that someone had been held there against their will. The second location was a remote farmhouse that had been purchased through the same shell company network that had funded Drake's activities. This time, the thermal imaging showed definite human presence, and the assault team prepared for potential hostages. The operation was swift and professional. Federal agents surrounded the property, neutralized 2 armed guards, and secured the building within minutes. But when they searched the premises, they found only the operational team. No hostages, no Kira, no indication of where she might have been taken. The third location was different. It was a cabin similar to the one where Jared and I had met, isolated and surrounded by woods, but the surveillance showed unusual activity patterns that suggested something more than just a safe house. As we approached the final location, Agent Coleman received a communication that changed everything. "We just intercepted a transmission from the target location," she said. "They know we're on our way, and they're threatening to harm the hostage if we don't pull back." "So we withdraw and negotiate?" I asked. "Not exactly," she replied. "They're not asking for safe passage or prisoner exchanges. They're demanding that you surrender yourself in exchange for the hostage's life." That confirmed what I'd suspected all along. This operation wasn't just about gathering intelligence. It was about eliminating me as a threat to whatever larger operation I'd unknowingly compromised during my military service. "What's the plan?" I asked. "Officially, we don't negotiate with terrorists or foreign agents," Agent Coleman said. "Unofficially, we're going to make them think we're considering their demand while we position assets for a rescue operation." But I had a different idea, one that would give us the best chance of saving Kira while also ensuring that the people who'd been targeting me would never be able to threaten anyone else. "Let me go in," I said. "Let me surrender myself like they're asking, but with backup ready to move the moment Kira is safe." "That's extremely dangerous," Agent Coleman replied. "If something goes wrong, we could lose both of you." "If something goes wrong with the assault, we'll definitely lose her," I countered. "At least this way, we control the timing and the circumstances." After a brief consultation with her superiors, Agent Coleman agreed to the plan. I would approach the cabin under the pretense of surrendering myself, while sniper teams and assault units positioned themselves for immediate intervention. As I walked toward the cabin, I reflected on how completely my life had changed over the past few months. I'd started as a victim of domestic conspiracy and evolved into a target of international espionage, I'd gone from being isolated and helpless to being supported by the full resources of the U.S. intelligence community. But most importantly, I'd learned that I was far more capable than I'd ever imagined when it came to protecting myself and the people I cared about, even people who'd once tried to destroy me. The cabin door opened as I approached, revealing a man I didn't recognize holding a pistol and wearing the kind of tactical gear that suggested professional training. "You came," he said in accented English that confirmed the Russian intelligence theory. "I came," I replied. "Now let her go. First, you come inside. We have questions for you." I entered the cabin, knowing that federal snipers were watching every window and that assault teams were positioned to move within seconds of my signal. But I also knew that the next few minutes would determine whether Kira lived or died, and whether the people who'd been hunting me would finally face the consequences of their actions. Inside the cabin, I found Kira tied to a chair, looking terrified but alive. She stared at me with an expression that mixed relief, guilt, and something that might have been love, though it was hard to tell after everything that had happened between us. "Hello, Kira," I said. "I'm here to take you home." The cabin contained 3 armed men in addition to the one who'd let me in, all of them carrying professional equipment and displaying the kind of tactical awareness that confirmed they were trained operatives rather than common criminals. Their leader, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, stepped forward to address me. "Mr. Fallon," he said, his English heavily accented but precise. "You have caused considerable difficulties for our operation." "That was the idea," I replied, keeping my hands visible while scanning the room for tactical advantages. Kira was positioned where she could be used as a human shield, but the operatives were spread out in a way that suggested they weren't expecting immediate rescue attempts. "You will answer questions about your current assignment, your security clearances, and your knowledge of counterintelligence operations targeting Russian assets in the United States." "I'll answer one question," I said. "How long do you think you have before this place is surrounded by federal agents?" The leader smiled coldly. "Long enough to extract the information we require and eliminate both of you before any rescue can be attempted." That was when I activated the transmitter hidden in my jacket, sending the signal that would bring the assault teams into action. But instead of waiting for backup, I decided to create my own tactical advantage. "Before you start asking questions," I said, "there's something you should know about the intelligence you've been gathering through my ex-wife." "Which is?" "It's all fabricated," I lied smoothly. "Everything Kira provided to Drake, everything she told you about my work and security clearances, it was all disinformation designed to identify foreign intelligence operations targeting military personnel." The leader's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. "Explain." "The whole domestic conspiracy, the insurance fraud, even Kira's cooperation with your operation. It was all part of a counterintelligence sting designed to trace foreign agents back to their handlers." I gestured toward Kira. "She's been working for us the entire time." It was a complete fabrication, but it had the desired effect. The operatives began looking at each other with suspicion, wondering if they'd been walking into a trap instead of conducting a successful intelligence operation. "You're lying," the leader said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Am I? Then explain how federal agents found all 3 of your safe houses simultaneously. Explain how they intercepted your communications and traced your financial networks. Explain how they knew exactly where to find you." The sound of helicopters approaching added weight to my deception. The operatives moved to the windows, trying to assess the tactical situation while keeping their weapons trained on Kira and me. "Even if this is true," the leader said, "you are still valuable as a hostage and source of information. We will extract what we need from you and eliminate the evidence." That was when the first sniper shot shattered the front window, taking down one of the operatives before he could react. The assault began immediately, with federal agents breaching the cabin from multiple directions while I threw myself toward Kira's chair. The firefight was brief but intense. The Russian operatives were skilled and well-equipped, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by the federal response team. Within minutes, 3 of them were down, and the 4th was wounded and surrendering. I cut Kira's restraints while Agent Coleman secured the scene, checking her for injuries and trying to assess her mental state after what had probably been the most terrifying experience of her life. "Are you hurt?" I asked. She shook her head, unable to speak through the tears and shock. Whatever else she'd done, whatever role she'd played in the conspiracy against me, she didn't deserve what these people had put her through. "It's over," I said. "You're safe now." The aftermath of the rescue operation took several hours to sort out. The surviving Russian operative was taken into federal custody, while intelligence analysts began processing the materials found in the cabin. The evidence would help identify other foreign agents operating in the United States and potentially prevent future operations against military personnel. Kira was taken to a hospital for evaluation and debriefing, while I spent the rest of the day being interviewed by various federal agencies about my role in uncovering the espionage network. The consensus was that my handling of the domestic conspiracy had inadvertently exposed a significant foreign intelligence operation which would result in commendations rather than criticism. But the most important conversation happened that evening, when Agent Coleman briefed me on the larger implications of what we'd discovered. The Russian operation was more extensive than we initially realized, she said. They've been targeting military personnel throughout New England for at least 2 years, using a combination of personal relationships, financial pressure, and blackmail to gather intelligence. How many people were compromised? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests dozens of cases similar to yours. Military personnel whose personal lives were manipulated to create opportunities for intelligence gathering or to neutralize them as potential threats. And now we roll up the entire network, Agent Coleman said with satisfaction. Your ex-wife's cooperation will be essential in identifying other targets and understanding the full scope of their operations. She's going to cooperate? She doesn't have much choice. She can help us prosecute foreign agents and potentially avoid federal prison, or she can remain silent and face charges for espionage, conspiracy, and treason. That evening, I visited Kira in the hospital, where she was recovering from her ordeal under federal protection. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by everything that had happened and the weight of consequences she was only beginning to understand. "Cedric," she said as I entered her room. I'm so sorry for everything." "I know," I replied, settling into the chair beside her bed. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Agent Coleman explained my options, she said. "I'm going to tell them everything, about Drake, about the Russians, about everyone who was involved in targeting you. I know it won't undo what I did, but maybe it will prevent them from hurting other people." That's a start. We talked for another hour about the conspiracy, about our marriage, about the choices that had led us to this moment. Kira explained how Drake had gradually drawn her into the operation, how each step had seemed reasonable until she was too deep to escape, how she'd convinced herself that she was protecting me even while she was helping to destroy my life. "I never wanted you to be hurt," she said. "I know that sounds impossible given everything that happened, but I really believed that the plan would just give us both a chance to start over." "With Russian intelligence services?" "I didn't know about that part until it was too late," she said. "By the time I understood what Drake was really doing, they had enough evidence of my involvement to force my cooperation. And now? Now I help the FBI catch the people who used me, and I hope that someday you might be able to forgive me for what I did to us." I looked at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the woman I'd loved with the person who'd spent months systematically destroying my life. The truth was, probably somewhere in between. She'd made choices that had led to terrible consequences, but she'd also been manipulated by people far more sophisticated than she was. "I forgive you," I said finally. But that doesn't mean I trust you, and it doesn't mean we can ever go back to what we had. I know, she said. I just wanted you to know that I loved you, even when I was betraying you. I know that doesn't make sense, but it's true. It makes sense, I replied. People are complicated, and love doesn't always make us do the right things. I left the hospital that night, knowing that it was probably the last time I'd see Kira as anything other than a witness in a federal prosecution. Our marriage was over, our shared life was finished, and we were both moving toward futures that would be shaped by the choices we'd made during this crisis. But I also left knowing that I'd survived something that should have destroyed me, that I'd turned a devastating personal attack into a victory that had national security implications, and that I'd discovered capabilities and strengths I'd never known I possessed. The next morning, I completed my preparations to leave Massachusetts and begin my new position with the Defense Intelligence Agency. The house had sold, my belongings were packed, and my old life was ready to be left behind. As I drove away from Maple Heights for the last time, I reflected on everything that had happened since that day when I'd overheard Raina planning my destruction. I'd started as a victim and evolved into something much more dangerous, someone who understood how to identify threats, gather intelligence, and execute operations that neutralized enemies while protecting innocent people. The Favren family had taught me that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, that vigilance was essential for survival, and that sometimes the best defense was an overwhelming offense. But they'd also taught me that I was far more capable than I'd ever imagined when someone made the mistake of underestimating me. The Russian intelligence operation had taught me that personal attacks could have national implications, that individual strength could contribute to collective security, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the hidden spaces of domestic life. But the most important lesson I'd learned was that secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when someone with the right skills and motivation decides to dig them up and expose them for all to see. As I drove toward Washington and my new career, I carried with me the satisfaction of knowing that everyone who'd tried to destroy me had instead been destroyed themselves. Raina was facing criminal charges and social exile. Jared had lost his career and his freedom. Drake was a fugitive from federal prosecution. The Russian operatives were either captured or eliminated. And Kira? Kira was alive because I'd chosen to save her, despite everything she'd done to me. She would spend the next several years helping federal prosecutors dismantle foreign intelligence networks. And maybe someday she would build a new life based on truth instead of deception. I'd won completely, decisively, and permanently. The people who'd thought they were hunting me had discovered what it felt like to be hunted by someone who was better at the game than they were. But more than that, I'd learned that I was exactly the kind of person my country needed in the fight against foreign threats. Someone who could identify deception, gather intelligence, and execute operations that protected national security. The conspiracy against me had been designed to destroy my life and eliminate me as a threat to foreign operations. Instead, it had forged me into exactly the kind of weapon that would be used to hunt down and neutralize the people who'd created it. No more secrets, no more lies, no more underestimating the quiet man who'd learned how to fight back. The road ahead was clear,